You came.
I told you I would.
You also told me to stay put.
I'll fuss about that later.
Welcome back to Two Hearts, where stories are weaved to explore the beauty of diverse cultures and the depths of human connection. In a small Oklahoma town, Merris, a transplanted attorney turned councilwoman, asks one too many questions, and as a result, someone decides that she needs to disappear. What begins as a fight for public records and missing reports quickly turns into a nightmare of threats, surveillance, and a municipality-wide conspiracy buried beneath small-town loyalties. Jay, the town's beloved law enforcement detective, doesn't trust Merris's methods, and Merris doesn't trust Jay's badge. But when intimidation escalates into something dangerous, they're forced into an uneasy alliance where every wrong move could be fatal. As evidence vanishes, powerful men close ranks, and danger creeps closer with every truth uncovered, Merris and Jay must decide how much they're willing to risk to expose what the town has spent years hiding and weigh the terrifying costs of refusing to stay silent. Please enjoy Eyewitness, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so that more members of our community continue to find content like this.
Redfield, Oklahoma sat on the seam where wheat country gave way to red dirt pasture. A town small and meddlesome enough to know the sound of every pickup on Main Street and stubborn enough to pretend it didn't. The land rolled in long, patient swells beneath an enormous sky, summer white-hot, spring tornadic, autumn gold as a hymn, and winter unpredictable and defiant. Cottonwoods huddled along Cottonwood Creek on the north side of town, and beyond them wind turbines turned with slow, indifferent grace, the nearest marker of the future most folks preferred to keep at a polite distance. The courthouse square was Redfield's compass point, a limestone building with a shallow dome, a flag that snapped like a reprimand, and steps polished by a century of boots. On the west side, a diner called Mabel's served chicken fried steak and gossip in equal portions. On the east, the old First National had been renovated into boutique offices, most of them empty, their for-lease signs sun-bleached into permanence. The only thing that changed quickly in Redfield was the weather. Merris Chambers stood at the base of those courthouse steps with her blazer buttoned against the wind, a leather briefcase in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other. The coffee was too weak, Redfield brewed it like it was afraid of scaring newcomers. But she held it anyway, like a peace offering to a town that still wasn't sure what to do with her. The wind teased a few strands loose from her sleek black hair, but it did nothing to diminish the composed beauty of her face or the quiet confidence carried in the rich brown glow of her skin. She lived in more zip codes than most people had cousins. Her father's Air Force career had stitched their lives across the map: San Antonio, Colorado Springs, Tacoma, back to San Antonio, until Merris stopped trying to memorize each new neighborhood and started collecting them like facts. The best fun near base, which school had the strictest dress code, how to tell if a stranger's smile was kindness or surveillance. Law school had been Merris's first act of defiance against impermanence. If she couldn't control where she lived, she could at least control how she moved through the world, precise, prepared, unafraid to ask hard questions. She took a job in Oklahoma City after graduation, thinking she'd finally settled. Then her father retired, her parents bought a house in Florida, and Merris realized the city had never been hers. It was just another stop. Redfield came up like a dare. She'd been driving back from a trial in Enid when she stopped for gas off Route 270 and noticed the courthouse dome on the horizon, the tidy grid of streets, the abandoned bank building with good bones. It looked like a place that had once believed in tomorrow. And for reasons she still couldn't explain, she'd wanted to be there when it learned how to again. 2 years later, she had a law practice on the second floor of the renovated bank, a nameplate that still looked too new on the frosted glass, Chambers Law, and a city council seat she'd won by 37 votes after promising modern jobs, better broadband, and a police oversight committee that had made half the town look at her like she'd announced an asteroid strike. She survived the whispers. The casserole diplomacy. The polite smiles that didn't reach eyes. What she hadn't yet figured out how to survive was Jameson Reed. Detective Jameson J. Reed stood inside the courthouse doors with a file tucked under his arm, the posture of a man who'd once been taught to own a room and had never entirely unlearned it. He was tall in a way that made door frames look personal, broad-shouldered in a way that had nothing to do with gym mirrors and everything to do with work, hauling evidence boxes, breaking up fights, carrying grief without advertising it. His sandy brown hair had been cut short enough to look practical rather than vain, and there was no missing the effect of his ever-searching blue eyes, set in a handsome face above a tall, broad, muscular frame built more by labor than show. A faint scar notched the edge of his hairline, and when he shifted his weight, Merris caught the subtle favoring of his left knee, like a secret he refused to call by its name. Redfield had raised him like a prized colt. Everyone in town could still recite his high school football stats the way other places recited Bible verses, state playoffs, a scholarship, the promise of something bigger than wheat and wind. He'd gone to college a hero and come back with an injury that ended the dream in one sharp twist, one pop heard by a stadium full of people who'd loved him like he belonged to them. He'd returned quieter, meaner around the edges, and with a new kind of hunger, not for touchdowns, but for answers. He'd joined the Redfield Police Department, learned the long math of interviews and paperwork, and the cruel patience of waiting for people to tell the truth. He'd moved up fast, partly because he was smart, partly because he didn't quit, and partly because the town trusted him on instinct. Now he was lead detective in a department small enough that lead meant he did everything. Homicides when they happened, burglaries surprisingly unwitnessed for such a nosy town, and the constant churn of domestic calls that left bruises no one talked about. He looked up as Merris stepped inside, and the air between them tightened like a knot pulled too hard. They met like this before across the clean line of the courtroom, where manners were required and mercy was optional. The first had been State versus Wallace, the bar fight case that should have ended with a plea deal until Detective Reed testified about a confession he'd taken in a hallway with no recording. Merris had asked, very politely, why the confession appeared for the first time in his supplemental report 3 days after she filed a motion to suppress. Jay had stared at her like she'd spit on the flag. The judge had suppressed it anyway. The defendant walked. The second had been City of Redfield versus Alvarez, a municipal ordinance case dressed up as a public nuisance prosecution. Jay had pushed for charges after a search that turned up stolen tools in a shed behind a rental house. Merris had won by finding the gap in the warrant description, an address error, a sloppy detail that made the search illegal. The prosecutor had blamed Merris for letting criminals off, and Jay had followed her out of the courtroom, his voice low and furious, saying, "You don't know what it's like when they're emboldened enough to do it again." The third wasn't a case. It was a council meeting 2 months ago, when Merris introduced a proposal for an independent review of officer-involved incidents and a clearer policy for evidence storage, mundane, unglamorous safeguards that should have been uncontroversial. Jay had sat in uniform at the back of the chamber, jaw locked, and when public comment opened, he'd walked to the podium and said, "This town trusts its police," like trust was a birthright and Merris was trespassing. And yet, every time they collided, something else flickered beneath the interaction. Heat, maybe. Recognition. A sense that the other person was built out of the same hard material, just pointed in a different direction. "Counselor," Jay's voice was a gravelly courtesy. Merris lifted her chin. "Detective. I didn't realize this was going to be your morning, too." He held up the file. "It's always my morning when somebody decides to make their issues my problem." "That must be exhausting," she said sweetly. Then, because she couldn't help herself, added, "Or maybe you just don't like being questioned." For a beat, his eyes sharpened, steel struck by flint. "You want to question me? Fine, but at least buy me breakfast first." Merris's pulse skittered, annoyed at itself. "I'll see you in there." Jay stepped aside to let her pass. As she moved by, his shoulder brushed hers, accidental, unavoidable in the narrow doorway, and the contact sent a shock through her like a live wire. She looked up, ready to throw a remark like a knife. But Jay's expression wasn't triumph or irritation. It was something darker, tighter. Like he'd just seen something over her shoulder that he didn't want her to turn around and notice. By late afternoon, the wind had shifted and brought the smell of rain that had yet to fall. Merris sat at the semicircle of tables in the Redfield Municipal Building's meeting room, a space that tried to look modern with cheap laminate and an aging projector. A framed photo of the town's 1911 Main Street hung slightly crooked on the back wall, as if even history had trouble standing straight in here. The agenda in front of her said, Public Safety Oversight and Accountability Committee. It sounded bureaucratic, harmless. In Redfield, it might as well have been a declaration of war. Chief Harlan Voss sat to Merris's right, his uniform immaculate, his smile practiced. Two council members, Eddie Rourke and Linda Sutter, watched Merris with the wary patience of people waiting for a storm to announce itself. Jay leaned against the back wall with his arms folded, not officially on the committee but present anyway, like gravity. Outside the room, Redfield's other argument simmered. Merris's proposal to bring an advanced manufacturing supplier, small but high-paying, into the vacant lots south of the highway, along with a fiber internet project that would finally stop the town from buffering through life. The deal required environmental remediation of an old parcel, a parcel that had belonged to the same family for generations and had recently been purchased, quietly, by one of the town's most influential men. Clayton Devereaux wasn't on the committee. He didn't have to be. His name moved through Redfield like currency. Owner of Devereaux Grain and Freight, benefactor of the high school stadium lights, friend to the sheriff, cousin to somebody in the state capitol if you believed the rumors. When he spoke at council meetings, people listened like it was church. Merris clicked her pen. Item 3, she said, is evidence storage and chain of custody standards. I'd like us to adopt a written protocol, including an audit schedule and a secure digital log. Chief Voss nodded as if she'd suggested new curtains. We already log evidence. In a spreadsheet, Merris replied. On a shared computer. Jay's jaw flexed once. Not disagreement, something closer to irritation that she was right in public. Linda Sutter gave a tight laugh. Merris, we don't have Oklahoma City money. We don't need Oklahoma City money, Merris said. We need Oklahoma City standards. She flipped a page. Next, investigative budget allocations. Detective Reed requested funds for outside lab testing and a part-time analyst for digital evidence. At that, Jay pushed off the wall. It's not a luxury, he said. It's the difference between catching someone and watching them do it again. For once, Merris didn't argue. She met his gaze across the room. I agree. But money without policy is just faith. And faith isn't an audit trail. A muscle jumped in his cheek. You want to help? Don't handcuff us with paperwork. Paperwork, she said, is what keeps your cases from falling apart in my courtroom. Your courtroom. Jay raised an eyebrow at her claim of ownership over the town's dedicated enclosure for legal proceedings. It's where I do some of my best work, she didn't miss a beat. The air hummed, a frequency only the two of them seemed able to hear. Eddie Rourke cleared his throat loudly, as if trying to break a spell. Merris continued, last, I want to flag something for the full council, the environmental assessment for the South Highway parcel. The state database shows prior industrial use and a remediation report that's... She paused, brow tightening. Incomplete. Pages missing. If we're going to bring new business here, we need a clean file. Literally and legally. Chief Voss's smile cooled. That's not within this committee's scope. It's within the town's, Merris said. From the back wall, Jay's eyes narrowed not at Merris but at Chief Voss. It was the first time Merris had seen that particular look on him, the look of a man recognizing a tell. When the meeting adjourned, Merris gathered her folders. Jay fell into step beside her in the hallway. "Watch where you dig," he said quietly. She gave him a sharp glance. "Is that advice, detective, or a threat?" Jay's mouth tightened. "It's a fact." Then he walked away, leaving Merris with the unsettling certainty that the ground under Redfield wasn't as solid as it looked. At 9 p.m., Redfield looked like a town holding its breath. Main Street lights cast pale circles on the sidewalk, and the wind moved paper against the curb with the patient insistence of a conscience. Merris sat alone in her office above the old bank, the kind of space that came with high ceilings and stubborn radiators. Her desk lamp made a warm island in the middle of stacks of files. On the wall behind her hung a framed print of the Constitution someone had given her as a joke when she ran for council. She'd kept it because she wasn't sure it was a joke. Her laptop screen glowed with the Oklahoma Open Records Act template she'd used so often she could write it from memory. She kept the language plain and polite. She addressed it to the county's records custodian. She requested the full remediation report for the South Highway parcel, any notices of violation, any correspondence between the town and the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality, and on a second request, the deed transfer documentation and any lien history for the same parcel. She hesitated only once, fingers hovering over the trackpad, then added a line, including all attachments and exhibits. Missing pages didn't happen by accident. Not twice. Merris's phone buzzed. A text from Tessa Merrin, "You still up? Courthouse clerk life equals chaos." Tessa was one of the first people in Redfield who'd treated Merris like a human instead of a referendum. Mid-30s, sharp eyeliner, sharper sarcasm, and a heart big enough to carry half the town's secrets without dropping them. Merris had met her in the records room during her first month in town. Tessa had watched Merris struggle with the copier and said, "Welcome to Redfield. The machines are hostile." Merris typed back, "Need a sanity check. Can a remediation report lose exhibits?" The dots appeared. Sure, like a person can lose a wedding ring at a pawn shop. Merris stared at the message until the humor drained away and left only the implication. She closed her laptop, grabbed her keys, and headed down the stairwell. She told herself she was going home. She told herself she wasn't going to the courthouse at night because she'd watched too many movies and had no interest in becoming the cautionary tale. On the sidewalk, the air smelled of wet dust and distant lightning. Her car sat at the curb under a street lamp. Nothing unusual, except that the dark sedan across the street had its engine running and its lights off. Merris slowed. She didn't stop. She kept walking as if she'd seen nothing, as if she were just another late-night lawyer in a town that didn't have many of those. She opened her car door, slid inside, and locked it. In her rearview mirror, the sedan didn't move. It simply idled, waiting, watching like it had nowhere else to be. Her first instinct was to call Jay Reed, not because she wanted him, but because he was the person in Redfield who took danger seriously. Her second instinct was to refuse the comfort of that thought out of pure spite. She started the car and drove, taking the long route around the square. When she checked her mirror again, the sedan pulled from the curb and followed at a careful distance. Merris's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She made 3 turns she didn't need and one she did, into the well-lit parking lot of Mabel's Diner. The sedan rolled past without slowing. Her heartbeat didn't settle. It simply changed rhythm, like it was listening. She sat in her car, the diner's neon sign reflecting across her windshield, and finally called Tessa. "You were right," Merris said when Tessa answered. "Somebody's losing things." There was a pause. Tessa's voice dropped. "Merris, go home. Lock your doors. And don't put anything in an email you wouldn't want printed out." "Why?" Merris asked. Because, Tessa said, and the humor was gone now too. People read what they want to read. The next morning, Merris arrived to find her office door ajar. It was a small thing. A misaligned latch. A gap of half an inch that shouldn't have been there. Redfield was a town of unlocked back doors and borrowed ladders, but Merris had locked hers anyway. She stood in the hallway and felt the hair rise on her arms. She pushed the door open with the edge of her briefcase, careful not to touch the knob. Inside, her reception area looked normal at first glance, brochures fanned on the table, the ficus still pretending it wasn't dying. Then her eyes landed on the glass frame of the Constitution print. It was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, the paper beneath intact but distorted. Her stomach tightened. That wasn't theft. That was a message. She stepped back into the hallway and called the police. Detective Reed arrived 12 minutes later in an unmarked SUV, coffee in one hand, latex gloves in the other. He saw Merris standing stiffly by her door and his expression changed, not soft exactly, but more alert, like an animal recognizing a new scent. "Don't go in," he said. "I didn't," Merris replied, even though she knew he could see the truth in the way the door was open wider than a breeze would have managed. Jay's gaze flicked over her face, then to the doorframe, then to the hall. "Who have you told about the records request?" Merris bristled. "Excuse me." "Answer the question." "It wasn't rude, it was urgent." Tessa, Merris said. "And the county custodian by filing it." Jay muttered something under his breath and ducked inside, careful with his feet as if the carpet could accuse him. He photographed the cracked frame, the desk drawers that had been opened and shut again, the faint scrape marks on the filing cabinet. He didn't narrate what he was doing, but Merris recognized the method in it, the way he created a record sturdy enough to survive court. Merris leaned in the doorway, arms folded tight. "So," she said, "is this where you tell me paperwork actually does matter?" Jay's mouth twitched once, the closest she'd seen him come to a smile. "Don't get excited." He opened the bottom desk drawer with a pen, not his fingers. Inside, Merris's stationery was scattered, as if someone had flipped through it impatiently. Jay lifted a single sheet with his gloved hand and held it up. On the paper, in block letters, someone had written, "Stop digging." Merris's throat went dry. "That wasn't there yesterday." "No," Jay said. His eyes stayed on the note like it might bite. "It wasn't." He set it in an evidence bag, sealed it, and for the first time that morning looked directly at Merris. The anger she expected wasn't there. What she saw was a grim kind of certainty. "You're in it now," he said. "I've been in it since I filed for council," Merris said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "This just confirms it." Jay exhaled slowly through his nose like he was counting backwards, avoiding something he wanted to say. "Listen to me. Whoever did this wanted you to know they can reach you. That means they're either sloppy or confident. Which one scares you more?" Merris asked. "Confident," Jay said without hesitation. He stepped closer and Merris fought the instinct to step back. The hallway suddenly felt too narrow for two stubborn people. "You need cameras," he said. "Better locks. And until we know who's behind this, you don't go looking for answers alone." "I'm not a civilian you can order around," Merris snapped. Jay's gaze dropped to her mouth for a fraction of a second, so quick she might have imagined it, then returned to her eyes. "I know exactly what you are," he said quietly. "And that's why you don't go alone." Merris didn't trust the warmth that rose under her skin. "Fine," she said, forcing her voice to stay crisp. "I won't go alone." She stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint stubble shadow at his jaw, close enough that she could tell he'd stopped breathing for the space of a second. "But if you're going to stand this close and tell me what to do," she added, "you're going to have to get used to me doing it back." Jay's eyebrows lifted, but his voice stayed low. "Is that a promise, counselor? You want me to stop digging?" Merris said. "Then help me dig the right way." She tipped her head, eyes steady on his. "You can't tell me don't go alone and then disappear when it gets complicated." His gaze flicked again, so brief it was almost unfair, then locked back on hers. If this parcel is tied to corruption, Merris continued, I need the records for the council. You need them for whatever case you're building. We share information. We do this clean. Jay stared at her long enough that Merris could hear her own breathing and his when he finally let it out. Then he gave a short nod. Clean, he agreed. And if you get hurt because you didn't listen to me, I'll. He stopped himself like he'd stepped too close to a ledge. Merris's voice softened, almost involuntary. You'll what, detective? Jay's eyes darkened. I'll regret it, he said, and the quiet honesty in it landed like a hand on her throat without touching. Clean, she reiterated. Clean, he confirmed, and the word sounded like a vow. Tessa met them after lunch in the courthouse basement, where the air smelled like parchment and old carpet glue. The records room was lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes and lined with metal shelves that held decades of Redfield's life. Deeds, plots, court filings, minutes of meetings where people argued about stop signs like they were moral failures. I don't love that you brought a detective, Tessa told Merris, then looked at Jay and added, no offense. Some taken, Jay said. Tessa rolled her eyes and slid a folder across the table. Here's what's publicly available without a fight. Don't ask me for anything sealed. I like my job. We're not here for sealed, Merris said. We're here for missing. They spread the papers out. Merris organized by date, Jay by relevance. It should have annoyed her. Instead, it felt complimentary. He noticed patterns in human behavior. She noticed patterns in ink. This deed transfer, Merris said, tapping the page with her pen, lists the parcel as unimproved pasture. But this older tax assessment flags a prior commercial structure. And this, she lifted a photocopy of an environmental form, says there was an underground storage tank removal in 1998. Jay's eyes narrowed. Gas station. Or something that someone wanted to look like one, Merris said. Tessa, hovering near the shelves as lookout more than helper, said quietly, there used to be a small chemical supply place out there. My dad said it burned down when he was a kid. Folks said it was lightning. Lightning doesn't file paperwork, Merris murmured. Jay shifted weight briefly off his left leg, then pretended he hadn't. Merris noticed anyway. She didn't comment. She filed it away the way she filed everything, for later when truth mattered more than pride. They were halfway through the folder when footsteps sounded in the hall outside the records room, slow, deliberate, not the harried pace of a clerk. Tessa's head snapped up. Nope, she whispered. That's not normal. The door opened. A man in a pressed button-down stepped in, carrying himself like he belonged in any room he entered. He wasn't from the courthouse. Merris could tell by the way he glanced at the signs like they were suggestions. Afternoon, he said, his smile friendly enough to be dangerous. Tessa Marin, long time. Tessa's face went carefully blank. Dawson Klein. Jay straightened. Who are you? Dawson, the man said, as if that explained everything. Clayton Devereaux's general manager. He looked at Merris then, and Merris felt the full weight of being recognized. Councilwoman Chambers. Mr. Devereaux asked me to tell you he appreciates your enthusiasm for the town. How thoughtful, Merris said. Does he send appreciation to everyone who files records requests? Klein's smile didn't move. Only the ones who could misunderstand what they're looking at. Jay took one step closer to the table, a subtle block between Merris and the door. This is a public records room, he said. You're not part of courthouse staff. Leave. Klein's gaze flicked to Jay's badge, then to his left knee, and Merris felt a flash of anger so sharp she almost spoke. Klein's voice stayed pleasant. Detective Reed, folks still talk about that playoff game. Shame about the injury. Jay's expression didn't change, but something in the room did. The temperature of it. The tolerance. Get out, Jay repeated, and this time it wasn't a request. Klein held up his hands. I'm going. Just passing along a message. He looked at Merris again. Be careful, councilwoman. Redfield doesn't like it when outsiders assume the worst. When the door shut behind him, Tessa let out a shaky breath. Okay, she said. Now I'm officially scared. Merris's hands had gone cold, but her voice didn't. Good, she said. Now it's real. Jay turned to her. That's the dumbest thing you've said since I met you. You say that like you're keeping a list, Merris shot back, and then, because adrenaline was doing strange things to honesty, added quietly, thank you for standing there. Jay looked at her for a long moment, as if he was deciding whether to let himself be seen. Don't make me the hero of your story, he said. Merris surprised herself by answering softly, I don't want a hero. Then, because the truth was suddenly right there and she was tired of pretending she didn't feel anything, she added, I want a partner. Someone who can keep up. Jay's gaze flicked over her face like he was cataloging the risk of wanting her. Careful, he murmured. I'm being careful, Merris said. That's why I'm asking you. Jay's gaze held hers for a long moment, then dropped to the spread of papers like he couldn't afford softness. Partner means you listen, he said. Even when you hate what I'm telling you. Merris's throat tightened. Deal, she said, and meant it. Her fingers brushed his wrist when she slid the folder toward him, an accident made believable by the cramped table, but neither of them moved away quickly enough for it to feel like one. Tessa cleared her throat, then slid a stapled packet from the folder and tapped the bottom margin with a fingernail. This is the copy that's been circulating, she said. The remediation summary the town's been using for years. Merris read the header, then the footer. It references Exhibit A through Exhibit F, she murmured, but none of the exhibits are attached. Jay leaned in over her shoulder, close enough that Merris could smell his coffee and the faint soap of his morning shower. The proximity should have made her step away. Instead, it made her focus hard on the paper, as if concentration could keep her pulse from doing something embarrassing. Exhibit B, Jay said, pointing. What's it supposed to be? Merris flipped pages. Underground storage tank closure documentation. Tessa gave a humorless laugh. Convenient thing to misplace. Merris pulled the newer packet against the older tax assessment and started making a list in the margin. Look, she said. This summary says the tank was removed and disposed in 98. But the tax assessment flags remediation pending in 99. And this form, she lifted the photocopy she'd already noted, has a handwritten notation that looks like an inspector's initials. Jay's gaze narrowed. Those aren't initials, he said slowly. That's a case number. The way we wrote them back before the department got computer-aided reporting. Merris stared at him. How do you know that? His expression turned inward, the way it did when memories hurt. My first year, he said. We had an illegal dumping complaint off South Highway. Barrels in a ravine. We never got a lab result. Evidence went missing from storage. He looked up at Merris, and his eyes were suddenly very clear. Same parcel. The room felt smaller. Not because the walls moved, but because the truth took up space. Chief Voss, Merris said, the name tasting like metal. Jay didn't answer at first. His silence was answer enough. Tessa hugged her arms around herself. You need to be careful, she whispered. You're stepping on old ties, old money. Merris gathered the papers into a neat stack. Neatness was how she kept panic from spilling. I'm going to request the full file directly from the state, she said. And I'm going to put this on the council agenda. Public session. Jay's head snapped up. No. Yes, Merris said, meeting him evenly. Sunlight detective. That's how you make it harder for them to erase things. Sunlight also makes you visible, Jay countered. For a moment they stared at each other across the table, the argument not about policy anymore, but about survival. Merris softened her voice. Meet me tonight at my office, she said. After you get off. We'll talk through the cleanest way to do it. Together. Jay looked like he wanted to protest again. Instead, he nodded once sharp. "Text me when you get back there," he said. "And don't stop anywhere." By 9:15, Main Street had gone dark enough that the shop windows reflected only the street lamps and whatever moved behind your eyes. Merris stayed late, the way she always did when she was angry at missing exhibits, at quiet threats, at the casual assumption that Redfield belonged to people like Clayton Devereaux more than it belonged to anyone willing to work for it. Outside, the wind had died. The air felt suspended, waiting for something. Her phone buzzed, a text from Jay, "On my way." "Stay put." Merris huffed a small laugh she didn't entirely trust. She typed back, "Come try to make me." The response came almost immediately. "I might." It was 3 words, nothing explicit, and it still sent a heat thread down her spine that had no business being there on a night like this. Spending more time on her research before Jay's arrival, Merris organized her records and files before finding a good stopping point for the evening. She printed 2 copies of her notes, stapled them, and locked one in her file cabinet. The other she slid into her briefcase like a shield. The parking lot behind the renovated bank building was technically public, painted spaces, a single security light that worked when it felt like it, and a dumpster that smelled faintly of fryer oil from Mabel's. During the day, it filled with courthouse employees and clients. At night, it belonged to nobody. He'd told her to stay put, but Merris needed to secure the second copy of her notes in a safe place. She'd be quick, she told herself as she walked briskly to her car, keys threaded between her fingers the way her mother had taught her when she was 16, and convinced she'd never be afraid of anything. Her heels clicked too loud on the pavement. She was 1 car length away from her driver's door when a figure stepped out from the shadow of the stairwell. "Miss Chambers," a man's voice said. Merris froze. The security light buzzed and flickered. In the stuttering illumination, she saw a baseball cap, the brim low. A work jacket. Hands that stayed visible, palms out, as if he wanted her to feel foolish for being tense. "It's late," Merris said, keeping her voice level. "Who are you?" "Just somebody bringing a message," he replied. "You don't want to make enemies over paperwork." She took 1 step back, angling toward the lot's open end and the street beyond. "Messages can be emailed." "Not this one." He moved fast, then faster than a man with friendly intentions, closing the distance with a practiced efficiency. Merris raised her keys, aiming for eyes, but another person came from her left, silent as the wind had been, and a gloved hand clamped over her mouth. The taste of rubber filled her throat. Panic flared hot and immediate. Her briefcase hit the ground with a dull thud. Papers slid out like white birds losing flight. Across the square, Jay Reed was having the kind of night that made him believe in patterns. He'd finished filing reports at the station, stared at the note from Merris's office until his eyes hurt, and texted her that he was on his way. Heading to his car, he told himself he was doing what he'd do for any witness threatened in a case. He told himself it was routine. He turned onto the alley behind the bank just as Merris's briefcase hit the pavement. Headlights swept the lot in a brief, revealing arc. Jay saw 2 men. He saw Merris's body jerk as she fought. He saw the gloved hand over her mouth. And he felt something in him go cold and steady, the way it did at the beginning of a fight. He killed his headlights and rolled forward on momentum, stopping behind a parked delivery van. His radio was on his shoulder, but if he keyed up now and gave away his position, they might hurt her. If he charged in alone, he might lose her anyway. Jay pulled his phone instead and used the other hand to steady binoculars he kept in his console for surveillance. Through the glass, he caught a glimpse of the first man's profile. Not local. Not anyone Jay recognized from Redfield's usual trouble. The second man dragged Merris toward a dark SUV idling near the dumpster, its back door already open. Merris's eyes found Jay's car for a split second. Maybe she saw the shape of it. Maybe she felt him the way you feel a storm before it breaks. The look on her face wasn't pleading. It was furious. Then the door slammed and the SUV lurched forward, tires spitting gravel. Jay's brain snapped into inventory. Make, model, damage to the left taillight, a partial plate, something like KJ7. The SUV turned out of the lot without headlights, then picked them up on the street as if it was just another vehicle heading home. Jay waited exactly long enough to make sure they weren't doubling back. Then he hit his own lights, swung out, and followed at a distance that hurt. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Reed, possible abduction in progress. Behind the old bank building on Main. Suspect's vehicle is a dark SUV, partial tag KJ, middle 3 unknown, last maybe 7. Heading south from the square. Start units. Notify sheriff." Static, then the dispatcher's voice, suddenly sharp. "Copy, Reed, units en route." Jay's eyes stayed on the taillights ahead. The SUV took 2 turns that weren't random, turns that suggested they'd done this before. At the edge of town, where the streetlights thinned and the road opened into black fields, the SUV accelerated. Jay's knee twinged as he pressed the pedal. He ignored it. Pain was information, he could use it later. The SUV signaled calm, absurdly polite, and turned onto a county road that ran between wheat stubble and barbed wire fences. Jay followed, keeping his distance. No heroic bumper-to-bumper chase. Just a man making himself a shadow. Half a mile in, the SUV's brake lights flared. It turned off again, down a narrower lane that cut behind a line of cottonwoods. Jay hesitated. If he went in, he might be walking into an ambush alone. If he didn't, he might lose Merris completely. He made a choice that warred with his instincts. He stopped at the county road, killed his lights, and watched the darkness swallow the SUV. Then he turned around and drove back toward town fast. At the parking lot, the scene was exactly as Merris had left it, her briefcase on its side, papers scattered across the pavement. The security light flickered above them like a failing witness. Jay crouched without touching anything. He photographed the tire marks in the gravel. He picked up one sheet by the corner with a glove, Merris's neat handwriting, a list of exhibit names and dates. In the margin, she'd written a single line that made his blood run colder than the Oklahoma night. Same parcel as the dumping complaint. Jay looked up at the empty street, at the quiet courthouse dome in the distance, and understood something he hadn't wanted to. This wasn't just intimidation. It was containment. His phone buzzed with a text he hadn't noticed come in earlier. It was from Merris, time-stamped at 9:47, still at office. "Door locked. You coming?" Jay's hand shook once, then steadied around the phone. "Hold on," he said to the night, to Merris, to himself. "I'm coming." The first hour after someone disappears is not cinematic. It is phones and forms and a sickening churn of decisions that can't be undone. It is people talking too fast and other people not talking at all. It is the clock turning into an enemy. Jay stood in the alley behind the old bank with his patrol lights throwing blue across the brick wall, making everything look like a crime scene even before it officially was one. 2 patrol units arrived first, Officer Lyle Benton and Officer Suki Patel, young enough to still be shocked by evil, old enough to have seen it anyway. The county sheriff's deputy rolled in behind them, a heavy-set man with a flat brim and a face that didn't give away what he was thinking. Jay forced his voice into the calm register he used in court. "Tape the lot. Nobody walks through. I need photos of tire tracks before they get stepped on. Patel, canvass Mabel's and the square, anyone who was outside, anyone who saw a vehicle leave fast. Benton, bolo on a dark SUV with left tail light damage, partial tag starting KJ, last digit maybe 7. Get it to county and highway patrol. Now." The deputy cleared his throat. Sheriff wants to know why he's hearing this from dispatch and not the chief. Jay swallowed the flare of anger. "Tell the sheriff I'm standing in Merris Chambers' parking lot looking at her papers on the ground. That's why. I notified dispatch. Now I'm notifying everybody else. He stepped away from the cluster of uniforms and called Chief Harlan Voss. It rang longer than it should at 10:45 on a weeknight. When Voss answered, his voice was too awake. "Read." "Merris Chambers has been taken," Jay said. "No softening. No easing into it. 2 male suspects. Dark SUV. I have partial tag and vehicle damage. I need you to activate the missing person protocol and call OSBI." A pause. Not shock. Calculation. "We don't know she's been taken," Voss said. "She could have left." Jay stared at the scattered pages near the curb, Merris's handwriting blown flat against concrete by the faint breeze. "Her briefcase is on the ground," he said. "There are drag marks and fresh tire tracks, and her phone's gone." "Activate it." Voss exhaled like Jay was the problem. "File your report," he said. "I'll handle the rest." The line clicked dead. Jay didn't move for a second. Then he put the phone back in his pocket with deliberate care, like if he didn't, he might throw it. "Partner means you listen," Merris had said. Clean, he'd promised. And now she was gone. Jay walked to the deputy and lowered his voice. "I need to speak to Sheriff Danley directly," he said. "Not through the chain. Not through Voss." The deputy's eyes narrowed, aware of politics, aware of danger, but he pulled out his phone and stepped away to make the call. While he waited, Jay called the only other person who'd been in the records room today. Tessa answered on the second ring, breathless as if she'd been holding it. "Tell me you're calling because you found the exhibits," she said. "Tessa," Jay said, and her name in his mouth made the situation real. "Merris has been abducted." There was a sound on the other end, like something hitting a counter. "No," Tessa whispered. "I need you to come to the station," Jay said. "You're a witness to the threat. And I need to know everything you know about Dawson, Klein, and Devereaux. Everything. No protecting your job. Not tonight." Tessa's voice shook, then steadied. "I'll be there in 15. Patel came back from Mabel's with a small notebook in her hand. "Diner staff says they closed at 10, she reported. One cook took trash out at 10:05. He saw a dark SUV idle by the alley for a minute, but he didn't think anything of it. No plate details. He says one taillight looked off." "Good," Jay said, because corroboration mattered even when it didn't feel like it would save anyone. He crouched near the smear of dust and gravel where Merris's heels had skidded. Flashlight beam low, he traced the drag marks toward the dumpster, then to where the SUV had been positioned. In the harsh white cone of light, he saw a glint near a tire track. He didn't touch it. He called Benton over. "Photograph then bag," he said. Benton swallowed and knelt with shaking hands. "It's a zip tie," he murmured. Jay's throat tightened. Zip ties meant restraint. Zip ties meant planning. "Bag it," Jay said. "And get me the city's camera map. Any building that faces this lot, any private camera we can ask for before the footage overwrites." "There's a camera on the bank entrance," Patel offered. "It's for the downstairs tenant." "Then we start there," Jay said. The downstairs tenant was a small accounting office that went dark at 5 and stayed dark. Jay called the owner anyway. Woke him up. Asked for a password. Got a sleepy, suspicious lecture about hacking and privacy, and Jay bit down on every impatient word until he had what he needed: a remote login and permission on a recorded line with dispatch. The footage was grainy and washed out under the flickering security light, but it showed enough. 2 figures moving too close to Merris. A brief struggle. Then the SUV dark, midsize angling out of the lot. Jay paused the frame at the point the vehicle passed under the street lamp at the alley mouth. The license plate was still a blur, but not completely. He leaned closer until his eyes burned. "KJ8, he said softly. "Or KJ8. Patel nodded. "And the last digit, 7 maybe." Jay rewound, watched the SUV turn south from the square, and felt the map of Redfield overlay itself in his head. The county road. The cottonwoods. The narrow lane that swallowed the vehicle. He hadn't gone in. He'd done the safer thing. The correct thing. He'd preserved the scene. He hated himself anyway. The deputy returned, phone still in his hand. "Sheriff's on," he said. Jay took the call and stepped away from the lights. "Sheriff Danley, this is Reed," he said. "We have an apparent abduction of Councilwoman Merris Chambers. 2 suspects, dark SUV, left taillight damage. Possible plate KJH unknown. I followed them briefly south and lost them down a lane off County Road 14 near the Cottonwoods." Sheriff Danley's voice was all gravel and authority. "You sure it's an abduction?" Jay looked at the zip tie in Benton's evidence bag and at the drag marks that ran toward the dumpster. "Yes, sir." "All right," the sheriff said. "I'm calling OHP to put units on the highways. I'm requesting assistance from Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. You're going to give me a written statement, and you're going to keep your hands where everyone can see them until I know which way is up in your department." Jay felt the jab of that. "Understood." "And Reed." "Yes, sir. If this is tied to Devereaux, you watch your back." Jay's mouth went dry. "Yes, sir." Backed by the patrol cars, Jay forced himself into motion. He dictated the basics into his recorder: time, location, suspect's vehicle. He handed Patel Merris's number. "Have dispatch request an emergency ping through her carrier," he said. "Endangered missing adult. Tell them we have evidence of abduction." Patel hesitated. "Chief has to authorize that." Jay stared at her. "Sheriff is authorizing it," he said. "Make the request through county if you have to." He looked at Merris's car, still parked where she'd left it. That alone made his chest hurt. If she'd had a chance, she would have driven. Merris never left herself without an out. He opened her driver's door with a glove, mindful of prints, and checked for anything obvious: her phone charger, a half-finished bottle of water, a legal pad on the passenger seat with her crisp handwriting. On the top line she'd written, "What would clean actually look like?" Jay shut the door gently, like the car was a sleeping animal. An hour later at the station, the fluorescent lights made everyone look tired and guilty. Jay sat across from Tessa in interview room 2 with a recorder on the table and a deputy from the sheriff's office in the corner as a witness. It wasn't a comfort. It was a message. Accountability was no longer theoretical. Tessa wiped her palms on her jeans. "I don't know anything about kidnapping," she said. "I file papers." "You know the town," Jay said. "Start there." Tessa swallowed. "Dawson Klein doesn't live here. He commutes. He's Devereaux's fixer. When he needs something done quiet, he uses contractors from out of town, guys who don't care about being recognized because they won't be here tomorrow." Jay kept his expression neutral. Where would Klein go if he didn't want to be seen? Tessa hesitated, then exhaled hard. "There's an old storage yard Devereaux owns off South Highway," she said. "Not the grain elevator. The other one. The one that used to be a chemical supply warehouse before it burned. The deed got shuffled around after the fire. Everybody forgot it existed." Jay felt his pulse spike. "Address?" "There's no address in the formal sense," Tessa said, voice thin. "It's a dirt road behind the turbines. You take County Road 14 until you hit the Cottonwoods, then you turn where the fence is patched with a sheet of corrugated metal. There's a gate that looks locked." "It isn't." Jay didn't let himself react the way he wanted. He asked the follow-up questions. Who had keys? How often people went there? Whether anyone had been seen hauling barrels lately. He got what he could and then stood up, leg stiff, heart moving too fast for the room. In the hallway, the sheriff's deputy who'd been observing said quietly, "That place is outside city limits." "I know," Jay replied. "Then you don't go alone," the deputy said, echoing Jay's own words back at him like a judgment. Jay stared down the corridor toward the station's front doors, toward the night beyond them. Every instinct in him wanted to get in his SUV and drive until he found Merris by force of will. Instinct was not evidence. Instinct sometimes got people killed. He pulled out his phone and called Sheriff Danley himself. "We have a potential location," he said. "Old Devereux Yard off South Highway, accessed from County Road 14 near the Cottonwoods. I need county units staged, and I need OSBI en route before we hit it." On the other end, the sheriff was silent for a beat. "Then hold, don't touch it until my people are there." Jay closed his eyes. "She doesn't have time for hold," he said. "Neither do you if this is a trap," the sheriff answered. "Do you want to bring her home, or do you want to die righteous?" Jay opened his eyes again. The station lights hummed. Somewhere in the building, a printer spat out paper like nothing in the world had changed. "Bring her home," Jay said. "Good," the sheriff replied. "Stall for 10 minutes. Then move with my units. OSBI's 30 minutes out." Jay hung up and leaned his forehead against the cool cinderblock wall for the space of one breath. Then he straightened and went to the briefing room. He drew the county map on the whiteboard with a marker that squeaked in protest. County Road 14. The Cottonwoods. The turbines. The patched fence. He assigned roles, reminded everyone that Merris was likely restrained, reminded them that shots fired meant courts and funerals and that neither was acceptable. When the units rolled out, Redfield slept on, oblivious. Jay drove in the second vehicle behind the sheriff's lead, his hands steady on the wheel. He kept seeing Merris's face in the instant before the SUV door slammed, the fury, the refusal to willingly comply. At the turnoff Tessa described, the patched fence appeared like a bruise in moonlight. A corrugated metal sheet rattled softly against posts. The gate beyond it was chained, but the chain hung loose, staged for show. The lead deputy killed his headlights. The convoy crawled forward. And there, in the shallow ditch beside the lane, half hidden under weeds, Jay saw something that made his stomach drop: Merris's handbag. The leather was scuffed and damp, the strap twisted like it had been yanked hard. Beside it lay one of her stapled packets, the corner darkened with night air. Jay pulled over suddenly, the lead SUV and the vehicles behind him observing his actions and following suit. Hopping from the vehicle, he crouched, gloved hands hovering until a deputy photographed the bag in place. Then carefully they opened it. Inside were the ordinary things that made Merris real: lip balm, a pen, a small pill case, and the things that made her dangerous: folded notes in her precise handwriting, a flash drive labeled in block letters, and her cell phone. The screen was lit. A red timer counted upward. Recording. For a second, no one spoke. Then Jay felt something in his chest tighten so hard it was almost pain. Merris had known. In the seconds before the rag stole her breath, she tried to leave them a trail. Deputy Haskins tapped the screen and played it back on speaker low. At first there was only wind and the sharp click of Merris's heels. Then a man's voice close, taunting. "You hear that?" he said. "No one's out here. Nobody's gonna help you. Nobody's gonna even know where to start." Laughter filled the SUV, soft, nasty. "By the time they figure out you're missing, you'll be a headline for a day and a rumor forever." Another voice cut in, colder. "Shut up." The first voice didn't stop. "She thinks she can walk into a town and rewrite it." The sound of something plastic tightening, zip ties ratcheting. "It's about time she's put in her place." "We weren't hired to talk," the second voice said. "We were hired to get rid of her. You want to make it personal, do it on your own time." The first voice scoffed. "I just might. And have a little fun with her before I'm done. And anyway, it is personal. She's making people ask questions." "Questions don't matter if the records disappear," the second voice replied. "Klein said it'll play out." We move her, we hold her, and by morning she's either quiet or gone. Simple. Merris's intake of breath was sharp and panicked. Then the second voice was antagonizing her again, close enough to sound like it was right at her ear. Listen, councilwoman. This is containment. You don't get to vote your way out of it. The first voice sneered, quieter now. Take the county road. Past the cottonwoods. Nobody's out there. What are the instructions once we get there? The second voice queried. Don't make it messy, the first voice said, almost bored. The recording ended in a muffled, struggling sound before silence. Jay's vision narrowed until all he could see was darkness and the shape of Merris's fear in sound waves. Rage rose in him so fast it felt like fire roared under his skin. Read. Danielle's voice from behind him was calm, but it settled like a hand on his shoulder. Do you recognize the voices? He asked. No, he growled. Look at me. Jay forced his eyes up. Danielle's expression didn't change, but his gaze sharpened. If you can't stay focused, I will pull you off this case, he said quietly. You're useful because you think. Not because you burn. Jay swallowed hard, tasting metal. I'm focused, he said through gritted teeth. Danley held his gaze for one more beat. Then he nodded once. Good, then draw on that. Because she did. Jay stopped breathing. They tossed her handbag because they hadn't intended for her to be found. Unfortunately for them, Merris Chambers was the smartest person in that SUV. The Devereux yard didn't look like much from the road. A sagging gate. A padlock that was more costume than barrier. Beyond it, the land sloped into a low basin where old gravel had been poured and forgot. Wind turbines turned on the ridge like pale sentries, their blades cutting the night into slow, indifferent pieces. The sheriff's lead unit stopped short of the gate. Engines went quiet. Doors opened with controlled soft clicks instead of slams. Deputies fanned out into the dark with flashlights taped low to their hands and voices kept to whispers. This wasn't a movie raid. This was an effort to keep a woman alive. Jay stayed close to the second unit, hands visible, jaw tight. Sheriff Danley had told him clearly that if Jay ran ahead out of pride or panic, he'd be pulled off the scene. Jay hated being managed. He hated even more that the sheriff was right. We contain, Danley murmured. We listen. We don't light ourselves up. Jay nodded, forced his thoughts away from the ditch where Merris's handbag lay like a shed skin, and from the phone inside it that had recorded her terror like a breadcrumb trail. The lane bent toward a cluster of structures, a corrugated metal warehouse with a roofline that sagged in the middle, 2 shipping containers stacked end to end, and an office trailer that leaned slightly as if the ground under it had given up. The air smelled faintly chemical, sweet, and wrong, beneath the usual Oklahoma sense of dust and vegetation. In the moonlight, Jay could see the darker stain of an old burn scar on the warehouse's west wall. Someone had repainted over it. The soot still showed through, like a bruise you couldn't cover. Merris woke to the taste of old dust and the throb of her own pulse. Her wrists were zip-tied in front of her, tight enough to hurt but not tight enough to cut. A strip of duct tape had been slapped across her mouth and then, sometime after she'd stopped fighting, peeled back and replaced with something worse, the quiet thread of a gag hanging loose around her neck like a collar. Her blouse was wrinkled and tugged askew from the struggle, one button missing, the hem pulled half free from her waistband. Nothing about it felt like seduction, it felt like violence in small humiliations. Merris's stomach twisted anyway. The drug fog left gaps in her memory, and gaps were where fear grew teeth. She forced herself to breathe. Whatever happened, she would find the facts. Facts were how you took your life back. She was on the floor of the office trailer, cheek pressed to thin industrial carpet. The air conditioner rattled in the window, but didn't cool much. Somewhere outside, a turbine groaned with the slow rhythm of a giant turning in its sleep. 2 men argued in low voices beyond the trailer door. One sounded local, the vowels familiar. The other spoke like he'd learned politeness as a tool. Merris kept her breathing shallow and listened anyway, cataloging details the way she did in court. Cadence, phrasing, what people said when they thought no one was writing it down. And underneath the fear, steady, present, useful, was something else she hated admitting even to herself, the certainty that Jay Reed would come. Not because he was a hero, but because he'd promised clean, and Jay Reed didn't break promises. Not the kind that mattered. Outside, the deputies finished their quiet geometry. One pair took the far side of the warehouse. Another covered the lane back to the road. A third watched the office trailer and the containers, weapons down but ready. The night pressed in close, making every cough and boot scuff sound like a noisy betrayal. Sheriff Danley lifted a hand. A deputy brought him the portable loudspeaker, its plastic casing scratched from years of use. Jay's stomach clenched. Callouts were the line between restraint and chaos. Do it too early, you'd spook whoever was inside. Do it too late, and you'd miss the chance to end it without blood. Danley raised the speaker. His voice rolled out across the yard, calm and authoritative. This is Sheriff Danley. If you're inside the structures on this property, come out with your hands up. We are here from Merris Chambers. Do not make this worse. Silence answered. Then a faint, almost a muffled groan emitted from the base of the trailer. Jay's muscles went taut. He looked at the trailer's thin door and imagined Merris on the other side, furious and afraid and alive. Danley lowered the speaker and glanced at Jay. That her. Jay's voice came out rough. Yes. Headlights appeared on the county road and then cut, letting the darkness swallow the vehicle's approach. An OSBI sedan rolled in like it knew how to be unobtrusive. Two agents stepped out, one woman, one man, both in plain clothes, both moving with the controlled economy of people who'd seen too many scenes like this. The woman introduced herself in a low voice. Special Agent Roland. Who's in charge? Me, Danley said. City detectives here as a witness and liaison. Roland's gaze flicked to Jay, measuring. You saw her taken. Yes, Jay said. Two suspects. Dark SUV. She's inside that trailer. Roland nodded once, already thinking 3 steps ahead. Then we treat this like an active hostage negotiation, she said. We keep the perimeter tight. We don't escalate. But we also don't let them move her again. Danley's jaw tightened. Agreed. Roland pointed to the trailer. Thin walls. If we breach loud, they'll hear it. If we breach quiet, we might get to her before they can reposition. Jay swallowed. They've got zip ties, he said. We found one at the abduction site. Roland's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. Okay, she said. We're going to do this like professionals. They reposition without drama, without speeches. A deputy moved back toward the warehouse and banged once on the metal siding, hard enough to sound like a clumsy step. Another deputy shifted his flashlight beam across the container doors, making shadows move. Danley lifted the speaker again. Last warning, he called. Come out now. At the trailer, Agent Roland, Jay, and Deputy Haskins moved in a tight line along the left side of the shipping containers, staying low and in the shadows. Jay's heart hammered against his ribs, too loud, too alive. His knee protested in a sharp flare when he crouched, but he ignored it. Roland held up a hand and listened at the trailer wall. From inside, a male voice close, irritated. I told you not to lose her purse. If that phone shows up, we're screwed. Another voice answered lower. It doesn't matter. Klein said it'll play out. People believe what they're told. Jay's jaw clenched. Same as the recording. Only now, there was a name associated with the directive. Klein, no longer a rumor, but a tangible threat. Roland nodded once, then pointed to the trailer door. It was a hollow core door with a cheap lock. A physical embodiment of false security. Jay stepped forward, hand on his weapon but not drawing it. He looked at Roland. On 3, he mouthed. Roland held up 2 fingers, then 1. Jay drove his shoulder into the door on the silent count of 3. The lock gave with a crack that sounded too loud in the night. Roland flowed in first, weapon up, light low. Haskins followed. Jay came in last and saw Merris on the floor. Her hair had come loose, strands stuck to her cheek. Her blazer was gone. Her blouse was rumpled from the fight, collar twisted, 1 button missing. She looked like she'd been handled like an object and refused to become one. Her hands were zip-tied, knuckles pale from strain. But her eyes were wide and furious and unmistakably alive. Police! Roland barked. Hands! Now! A man near the back of the trailer spun, startled, his hands lifting too late and too wrong. He made a frantic grab toward a drawer. Don't, Jay said, voice flat. The man hesitated, and that hesitation was the difference between violence and restraint. Haskins tackled him into the thin wall with a sound like wood complaining. Roland snapped cuffs on him fast, efficient. In the cramped space, Jay knelt beside Merris, careful not to touch her wrists too hard. Merris, he said, and the way he said her name felt like an admission. Look at me. Her gaze locked on his. For a second, the fury cracked and something else showed through, relief sharp enough to hurt. Took you long enough, she rasped, voice rough from the gag he'd removed. Jay let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. His hand hovered near her cheek then, because he didn't trust himself, went instead to the zip ties. He could feel the rage in him like a pulse, hot and ugly, demanding to be spent on someone. He looked up once and caught Agent Roland's eyes, steady, warning, professional. Jay swallowed it down. I'm going to cut these, he said, voice controlled. Tell me if I'm hurting you. You're hurting my pride, Merris croaked, and Jay laughed despite himself. Counselor, he began. Merris's gaze held his, and something in it steadied him. I'm okay, she said hoarsely. I'm foggy. But I'm okay. Of course you are, Jay said low. Roland glanced over. Reed, stay focused. Jay fished his folding knife from his pocket with a hand that finally shook. He slid the blade under the plastic and cut. The ties snapped loose, and Merris flexed her fingers as if testing her own reality. Jay's eyes swept her, checking for injuries the way he'd been trained to, the way he couldn't stop. Anything else? He asked quietly. Did they? He tried again. Did they hit you? Did you black out? They drugged me, Merris said. Something in a cloth. I fought. I started the recording on my phone, at least I think I did, before the fog overtook me. She blinked hard, searching for the edges of her memory. They shoved me into the trailer. Zip ties. Threads. No other injuries. Relief hit Jay so hard it made him dizzy, chased immediately by fury that she'd had to confirm any of it out loud at all. They threatened council records, Merris continued, voice steadier now. They kept talking about containment. Jay's mouth went grim. They're going to learn a new word, he said. Outside, a shout cut through the night, deputies calling movement near the warehouse. The sound of feet on gravel. A vehicle door slamming. Roland's head snapped up. Second suspect. Merris pushed herself upright, unsteady but stubborn. He went out the back, she said. He has a radio. Jay stood, instinct pulling him toward the door, and then he felt Merris's fingers curl around the sleeve of his jacket. The touch stopped him harder than any command. Don't, Merris said, voice low and fierce. Don't go alone. Jay froze. It was his line. His warning. And hearing it from her, after everything, made something in his chest rearrange itself. He covered her hand with his just once. Grounding, not possessive. I won't, he promised. Then softer so only she could hear, I'm here. I've got you. Merris's throat bobbed. Her eyes stayed on his like she was trying to memorize him. You better, she whispered. Jay's thumb brushed her knuckles, barely, like he was asking permission in a language he'd never spoken out loud. "I intend to," he said. He looked to Roland. "She's coming out with you," he said. "Get her to a unit. EMS if she'll allow it." Merris opened her mouth to argue. Jay leaned in close enough that his breath warmed her ear. "Listen," he murmured, the word both command and plea. "Just this once." Merris's eyes narrowed, then impossibly softened. "Fine," she said. "But you owe me." Jay swallowed. "Name it." Her gaze dropped to his mouth and back up. "Later," she demanded, and the single word struck him like a match. Jay forced himself away, stepping back into the night. The yard had erupted into controlled chaos, flashlights sweeping, deputies calling positions, the sheriff's voice cutting through it like a blade. Jay kept his weapon low as he moved along the container's edge, following the sound of boots and breathing. Near the warehouse, a deputy had a man face down in the gravel, knee between shoulder blades. The suspect's hands were cuffed behind him. His baseball cap lay a few feet away, trampled. The dark SUV idled near the warehouse door, driver's side door open as if he'd meant to run and thought better of it. Sheriff Danley approached, his eyes hard. "We got him before he could take off," he said. He tried to claim he was just security. Agent Roland walked up with a clear evidence bag already in hand. Inside it was a cheap handheld radio and a set of keys on a lanyard printed with Devereux grain and freight. Jay's stomach tightened. "That'll play nice in court," he said. Roland's gaze was flat. "If it makes it to court," she replied. Jay looked toward the trailer. A deputy was guiding Merris out, her shoulders hunched against the night air, bare-armed now without her blazer. She moved like a woman who refused to collapse in public. Jay started toward her, then stopped himself. "Evidence first. Procedure. The clean path." He watched Roland photograph the SUV's interior, duct tape on the passenger's floorboard, a pair of gloves, a rag with a faintly sweet stench. He watched deputies mark the tire tracks and the gate chain staged for show. He watched the sheriff's men secure the yard, control the scene, keeping the story from becoming rumor before it became record. Only when Merris was seated on the bumper of a deputy's unit, wrapped in a blanket someone had grabbed from a trunk, did Jay let himself approach. She looked up as he came near, and for the first time since he'd known her, Merris didn't have a sharp remark ready like armor. Her eyes were tired. Bright. Furious in a different way. "You came," she said, voice quieter now. Jay stopped in front of her. "I told you I would." "You also told me to stay put," Merris said. Jay exhaled. "Yeah, I'll fuss about that later." She lifted her chin, stubborn even under a blanket. "But I listened," she said. "I remembered the license plate pattern from your notes. I listened to their voices. I didn't let them take the information out of my head." Jay's throat tightened. He crouched so he was level with her. "That's my girl," he said before he could think better of it. Merris blinked, surprised, and then a slow, dangerous smile tugged at her mouth. "Detective," she murmured, that sounded suspiciously like a claim. Jay felt heat rise under his collar, the kind that had nothing to do with the Oklahoma weather. He kept his voice steady. "It sounded like relief," he said. Merris held his gaze. "Good," she said softly. "Because you're going to have to get used to it." Jay's eyes dropped to her hands, free now, bruised at the wrists, and he fought the urge to pull her into him in front of deputies, OSBI, and the entire machinery of consequences. He settled for reaching out and tucking the blanket tighter around her shoulders, his fingers brushing the warm skin at her collarbone for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "This isn't over," Jay said. Merris's eyes sharpened again, the lawyer returning. "No," she agreed. "Now it's documented." In the distance, wind turbines turned on, indifferent witnesses to a town that was about to be forced to tell the truth. The hospital in Redfield was small enough that people still called it the clinic, even after it technically became a critical access hospital with a new wing and a grant-funded CT machine. It sat on the north edge of town near Cottonwood Creek, a low building of tan brick and humming air conditioners, always smelling faintly of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee. Merris sat on an exam table in a paper gown, a thin hospital blanket across her lap. A nurse with kind eyes photographed the bruising at her wrists with a ruler in the frame. Another nurse swabbed her cheek and under her nails, explaining each step with careful neutrality, evidence collection that treated her body like a scene, though she tried gently not to make her feel like one. "We can do a blood draw for toxicology," the nurse said. "Given what you described." Merris nodded. "Do it," she said. She wanted everything recorded. Everything counted. Every fact nailed down so no one could later call it hysteria. A victim advocate introduced herself as Marlene, offered water and to call someone Merris trusted. Merris surprised herself by answering without hesitation, "Detective Reed is here." Jay waited in the hallway outside exam room 3 with his back against the wall and his hands shoved into his jacket pockets so nobody would notice how badly they were shaking. Sheriff's deputies moved past him with clipboards. An OSBI agent spoke quietly to a doctor. The fluorescent lights made everything look too sterile and honest. He'd been told repeatedly that Merris was alive. He'd watched her walk under her own power into the hospital, blanket around her shoulders, spine straight as if pain was negotiable. None of it stopped the image of her being shoved into that SUV from replaying in his head like a looped video he couldn't shut off. Agent Roland found him and held out a paper cup of coffee. "She asked for you," Roland said. Jay's throat tightened around the words. "Can I see her?" "After the exam," Roland replied. "And after her statement to us, not to you." Jay's jaw flexed. "I'm not contaminating the witness," he said, because professionalism was all he had left when fear stripped everything else away. Roland studied him, then nodded. "Good," she said. "Then you can be what she needs." Merris gave her first statement to OSBI sitting upright on the exam table, hospital gown tied with more determination than dignity. Agent Roland took notes by hand even though a recorder sat on the counter, as if the act of writing mattered. "2 males," Merris said. "One local accent, one not." "The one who spoke more," he said. "Klein said it'll play out." "That's the phrase. It'll play out. Like this was a board game." "Did you see their faces?" Roland asked. "Not clearly," Merris admitted. "Cap brim was too low. But I can tell you how they moved. One of them was trained. Efficient. Not panicked." Roland's pen paused. "Trained how?" "Security," Merris said. "Or corrections." He used a zip tie like it was routine. Merris swallowed and forced herself to keep going. "They had a rag. Sweet smell. Like chemical fruit. They pressed it to my face. I fought until I couldn't." Roland's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened. "You said containment." "Yes," Merris replied. "They said the town needed containment. They said the council agenda needed containment. And they talked about your involvement like it was annoying." She met Roland's gaze. "This wasn't about me personally, I don't think. I was leverage." "Leverage for what?" Roland asked. Merris's voice went colder. "For silence." When Roland finally stepped out, Marlene the advocate touched Merris's shoulder and asked if she wanted Detective Reed brought in. "Yes," Merris said. Jay entered like he was walking into a courtroom, controlled, careful. But the moment his eyes met hers, the control thinned. "You look awful," Merris said. Jay blinked. "You were kidnapped. And you're still the one who looks like he hasn't slept in a week," she replied. Jay's mouth tightened, fighting something. "I should have gone after them," he said quietly. "I should have." "No," Merris cut in, sharp enough that the word startled him. You did the right thing. You preserved the scene. You got the sheriff involved. You brought OSBI. She held his gaze. You brought me home. Jay took a step closer to the exam table. His hand hovered, unsure where he was allowed to touch. Merris solved it by extending her fingers toward him, palm up. He took her hand carefully, like it was evidence and something precious at the same time. His thumb stroked once, a small, involuntary motion that sent heat up Merris's arm like a spark on a wire. Merris watched his face, how close the exhaustion sat near the surface, how the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened when he tried not to feel anything too unmistakably. You can let go, she said, but her fingers tightened around his before he could. Jay's voice went rough. No, he said. I can't. That's not very procedural, Merris murmured. I'm off the clock, he said, and the way he said it made her breath catch. A nurse knocked softly and stepped in with a tray for the blood draw, and Jay moved as if to step back. Stay, Merris said, quiet but absolute. If you leave this room, I'm going to start pretending I'm fine again. I don't want to do that with you. Jay froze. Then he nodded once, like a man accepting terms. He shifted closer to her, blocking the view of her shaking hands from the doorway. His knee brushed the exam table and Merris felt the heat of him, solid, real, anchoring her in place. You don't have to be fine, Jay said. Not with me. Merris's throat tightened. She tried for sarcasm and missed. Be careful, detective, she said. You keep talking like that, and I'm going to start believing you mean it. Jay's gaze dropped to her mouth again, longer this time. I do mean it, he said. For a fraction of a second, the room narrowed to the space between them, the antiseptic smell, the hum of fluorescent lights, the soft rustle of her paper gown. Jay leaned in, slow enough that Merris could have stopped him, and Merris tilted her chin up without thinking. The nurse cleared her throat. Sorry, she said, not sounding sorry at all. Which arm? Jay pulled back like he'd been burned, jaw tight, eyes dark. Merris pressed her lips together to keep from smiling at the absurdity of it and the ache of it all at once. I'm going to make sure this sticks, Jay said. In court. On paper. In their lives. Merris's lips curved faintly. That sounds like a threat. Jay's eyes darkened. It's a promise. Her pulse tripped. She didn't look away. Good, she said. Because I'm not going quiet. Jay's grip tightened just slightly. I know, he murmured, and the way he said it carried both admiration and fear. Merris watched him for a long beat, then said softer, stay until they're done drawing blood. Jay's hand remained wrapped around hers while the nurse worked. He didn't watch the needle, he watched Merris's face like it held instructions for how to survive this. When she flinched, his thumb brushed her knuckles in a silent apology. You know, Merris said when the vial clicked into place, this is the part where you're supposed to say something reassuring. Jay's mouth twitched. I already did. No, she corrected, eyes steady on his. You promised consequences. I'm asking for something else. Jay's gaze sharpened then softened. Okay, he said quietly. I'm here. You're safe. And nobody gets to put their hands on you again. Merris's breath left her in a slow exhale. Careful, she whispered, and this time it wasn't a warning. It was want. Jay swallowed. Yeah, he said. I'm not going anywhere. While Merris was examined and interviewed, the yard became a lesson in patience. OSBI processed the SUV under portable lights, photographed the interior, lifted prints from the door handle and the center console, swabbed the rag for chemical residue, and collected the duct tape roll from the passenger's floorboard. The zip ties found at the abduction site were tagged separately from the zip ties in the trailer, same lot numbers, same purchase histories if they were lucky. Agent Rowland watched each evidence bag sealed and labeled, watched signatures added to chain of custody forms like a ritual. If we're going after a name like Devereaux, she said to Sheriff Dannelly, we do it in a way that survives court. Jay stood close enough to hear, far enough not to interfere. He wrote his supplemental report twice, once in his notebook, once in the system, because he didn't trust computers and because he trusted people even less. At 2 a.m., Roland walked up with a clear bag containing the lanyard keys and the handheld radio. "You were right about Klein," she told Jay. "One suspect's phone has his number saved under DK. Call log shows contact within an hour of the abduction." Jay's stomach tightened. "And the other?" "The other is smarter," Roland said. "No contacts. Burner. But we'll pull cell tower dumps along the route." Roland's phone buzzed. She read the screen, then looked up at Jay with an expression that went from professional to sharp. "We ran the lanyard," she said. "It's a Devereaux Company issue. But the keyring also has a small brass tag, serial numbered. You know who uses those tags?" Jay's mouth went dry. "Property room," he said. Roland nodded. "Evidence storage. And before you say it, no, it doesn't mean your chief did it. It means someone with access to your property room supplied materials. Keys, tags, maybe zip ties from seized stock. But it is a bridge between Devereaux and your department." Jay stared past her at the dark outline of the warehouse, at the repainted burn scar, at the way everything in Redfield seemed to connect if you dug hard enough. "We need the property room logs," Jay said. "We've already requested them," Roland replied. "From the sheriff. Not from your chief." Jay's throat tightened with something like gratitude and something like grief. "Good," he said. By dawn, the storm Merris had smelled days ago finally arrived, not with thunder, but with a gray ceiling of clouds that made Redfield look washed clean and exhausted. Merris was discharged with paperwork and a warning to rest that she accepted like a challenge. Jay walked her out, OSBI and the sheriff both insisting on a deputy sitting in her driveway until further notice. Merris didn't argue about that part. She argued about everything else. "You want me to wait for the investigation?" she asked Jay in the hospital parking lot, blanket folded over her arm like a flag. "That's what everyone keeps saying. Wait, let them handle it." Jay rubbed a hand over his jaw. "I want you alive," he said. "I want you to make it to whatever fight you're planning." "Then help me plan it," Merris said. She stepped closer, voice dropping. "They grabbed me in a public parking lot because they thought nobody would believe me. They thought I'd be quiet out of embarrassment or fear." Her eyes flashed. "I'm not giving them that." Jay's gaze swept the lot, OSBI vehicles, a deputy smoking near the curb, a nurse on break pretending not to listen. Then he looked back at Merris and let himself say it, "If you go public the wrong way, they'll come again." Merris's mouth tilted. "So we do it the right way," she said. "Clean." Jay exhaled. "Emergency council session," he said. "Closed meeting with OSBI present. You present what you found about the parcel. OSBI presents that you were abducted because of it. We put Devereaux in the spotlight with a record attached." Merris's eyes softened at the edges. "That," she said, "is why I wanted a partner." Jay's hand lifted, then hesitated, then settled at her waist for the briefest moment, steadying her, claiming nothing, saying everything. "And that," he murmured, "is why you scare the hell out of me." Merris's breath caught. She leaned in just enough that only he could hear. "Good," she said. "Stay scared. It keeps you honest." Jay's mouth curved, a shadow of a smile. "You're impossible." "And yet," Merris said, eyes on his, "you keep showing up." Jay held her gaze, heat and worry braided tight. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Behind them, Redfield's morning traffic began to stir, unaware it was about to learn a new story about itself. The municipal building looked different with deputies at the doors. On paper, it was still the same low brick structure with a flag out front and a parking lot full of potholes that no one could ever seem to budget away. In practice, it had become a checkpoint. Two sheriff's deputies stood by the glass doors, hands resting near their belts, eyes scanning faces as people filed in for the emergency session called with less than 24 hours' notice. Word had traveled anyway. It always did. Half the town seemed to have shown up: farmers in seed caps, office workers on early lunch breaks, retirees who treated council meetings like sport. The room smelled like wet denim and coffee, and the electrical heat of a crowd ready for a story. Merris arrived through a side entrance with Agent Rowland and Sheriff Danley. Jay walked at her shoulder, close enough to steady her if she wobbled, far enough not to invite gossip that would drown out what mattered. Her wrists were hidden under the cuffs of a well-styled cardigan, but Jay still saw the bruises when she moved. He saw her swallow pain and present control like armor. "You don't have to do this today," Jay murmured as they paused outside the meeting room. Merris looked up at him. In the fluorescent hallway, her eyes were very bright. "If I don't do it today," she said softly, "they'll spend tonight rewriting what happened to me." Jay's jaw clenched. He wanted to say something reckless. Instead, he nodded once. "Then I'm here," he said. The whole time. Her gaze flicked to his mouth, quick, private, before she turned back to the door. "Good," she said. "Try not to look like you're going to arrest the entire town." "No promises," Jay replied. The meeting began as Redfield meetings always did, with ritual, roll call, pledge, approval of minutes. Only tonight, the rituals felt like a fragile attempt to make chaos behave. "We will now enter executive session," Mayor Callahan announced, voice tight, "for consultation with law enforcement regarding an active investigation and for discussion of security." The gavel sounded louder than it should have. The public was ushered into the hallway, grumbling and craning for glimpses. Inside the room, the door shut and the sound of the crowd became a muffled ocean. At the table sat Merris, Mayor Callahan, Eddie Rourke, Linda Sutter, and two other council members Jay only half listened to. Sheriff Danley sat with his hat on his knee. Agent Rowland set a slim folder on the table and opened it like a judge opening a file. Chief Harlan Voss sat at the far end, uniform crisp, expression composed. Jay stood behind Merris's chair with his arms folded, forcing himself to be the quiet kind of dangerous. Rowland didn't waste words. "Councilwoman Chambers was abducted last night in the parking lot behind her office," she said. "She was held at a Devereux-owned yard and recovered alive. 2 suspects are in custody on kidnapping and conspiracy charges. We have evidence tying the suspects to Dawson Klein and Devereux operations." Linda Sutter's hand flew to her mouth. Eddie Rourke muttered, "Jesus." Voss cleared his throat. "With respect," he said, "this is an ongoing matter." "I don't see why OSBI is." Rowland's gaze turned to him. It wasn't angry. It was surgical. "Because the crime involved public corruption indicators," she said. "And because you attempted to delay activation of a missing person protocol despite physical evidence of abduction." Color rose in Voss's neck. "I followed procedure," he snapped. "We're going to talk about procedure," Rowland said. She slid a copy of a log across the table. "This is a preliminary extract from the Redfield Police Property Room Access Records," she said. "For the last 72 hours. Entries include badge IDs, keypad codes, and camera timestamps." Jay watched Voss's eyes flick down, then up, then still. "Not surprise. Recognition. Someone removed evidence tag blanks and a numbered brass key tag," Rowland continued. "The same type found on the suspect's key ring at the yard. The access record traces that removal to a login assigned to Chief Voss." The room went silent in a way that made Jay's skin prickle. Even the building seemed to stop humming. Mayor Callahan's voice came out hoarse. "Chief." Voss's smile was small and wrong. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "And it's also, if it's even accurate, something that could be explained by my administrative duties." Then explain why your departmental SUV appears on the accounting office camera at the alley behind Chambers Law at 9:22 p.m. yesterday, Roland said, flipping another photo onto the table. And explain why your phone shows a call to Dawson Klein at 9:31. Jay didn't move. He didn't need to. The evidence moved for him. Voss stared at the photo as if it had betrayed him. When he looked up, his composure had cracks. "You can't," he began. "We can," Danley said quietly. "And we are." Roland folded her hands. "Here's what we're recommending. Immediate administrative leave for Chief Voss pending criminal investigation. Sheriff's Office will provide interim coverage. OSBI will take lead on the corruption and kidnapping conspiracy. Council will preserve all municipal records related to the South Highway parcel and Devereux agreements. No deletions. No misfilling." Merris's voice cut through the room, steady. "And the development deal is paused," she said. "Not cancelled. Paused. Until the parcel is clean, legally and environmentally." Voss's gaze snapped to her, hatred bared for the first time. "You think you can walk back in here after?" Jay leaned forward just enough for his shadow to fall across Voss. "Watch your mouth," he said softly. For a second, Voss looked like he might challenge him. Then he looked away, as if calculating which fights were still winnable. When they reopened the doors, the room refilled with noise. The public filed back in, faces eager, anxious, suspicious. In the third row, Dawson Klein sat with his hands folded, and his smile turned on like a porch light. Clayton Devereux wasn't there. Men like Devereux rarely came in person when the air smelled like consequences. Merris took her seat at the dais. She felt Jay behind her, steady, silent, and drew strength from it she didn't want to need and didn't want to lose. Mayor Callahan cleared his throat. "This council has been briefed by the Sheriff's Office and OSBI regarding an active investigation," he announced. "For public safety and to preserve the integrity of that investigation, we are taking the following actions effective immediately." He read them: interim law enforcement coverage, preservation orders, suspension of negotiations on the South Highway parcel. Then he paused and the room leaned in. "Chief Harlan Voss has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation." The uproar hit like inclement weather. People shouted questions. Someone yelled, "That's a lie." Someone else yelled, "About time." Klein's smile didn't move, but his eyes did, calculating, tracking exits. Merris lifted her microphone. "Redfield," she said, and the single word carried farther than the mayor's gavel. The room quieted in reluctant increments. She stood, hands flat on the table, and felt the bruises on her wrists pull beneath her sleeves. "I was abducted last night because I filed public records requests," she said. "Because I asked for missing exhibits. Because I refused to accept an incomplete file on a parcel that the town is being asked to build our future on." A murmur swept the room, disbelief and anger braided together. "If you want to be mad," Merris continued, "be mad at the people who believe Redfield belongs to them. Be mad at the people who treat you like an audience instead of a community." Her gaze slid briefly to Dawson Klein. "Be mad at the people who think threats work." Klein's eyes met hers. For the first time, something sharp flickered in them, warning. Jay felt Merris's pulse change because he could read her now. He leaned in close enough that only she could hear. "Don't take the bait," he murmured. "I'm not," Merris whispered back. Then into the microphone, louder, "This is not about politics. It's about whether we still believe in the rule of law." Agent Roland stepped forward. She didn't share details that would compromise the case. She didn't need to. She simply said, 2 suspects are in custody. Additional arrests may follow. Any attempts to destroy records will be treated as obstruction. From the back of the room, someone stood up in a sheriff's uniform and walked to Chief Voss, who had remained in the corner like a man pretending patience. The deputy leaned in, spoke quietly. Voss's face hardened. He looked once at Merris, pure blame, then allowed himself to be escorted out through the side door. The room watched him go, stunned into silence by the sight of authority being removed. Merris sat down slowly, hands trembling just enough that she curled them into fists under the table. Jay's hand brushed her shoulder, one brief touch, hidden from most eyes, felt by all her nerves. "You did it," he murmured. Merris didn't look at him. If she did, she might fall apart in public. "We did," she said. After the meeting, the hallway filled with reporters from the county paper and one TV crew from Oklahoma City, their camera light harsh against Redfield's tired paint. People demanded answers. People demanded comfort. The town wanted a simple villain it could boo before turning in for the night. Jay walked Merris down the back corridor instead. Sheriff's deputies held a clear path. Agent Rowland spoke into her phone, low and relentless, arranging warrants and subpoenas like pieces on a chessboard she intended to win. At the exit, Jay glanced back into the meeting room through the small window in the door. Dawson Klein was gone. Jay's stomach dropped. "He slipped," he muttered. Merris's jaw tightened. "He didn't slip," she said. "He ran." Rowland joined them, expression hard. "We've got enough for search warrants on Devereaux properties and Klein's phone records," she said. "But we don't have Klein in cuffs yet. And until we do, you two don't move without a deputy." Merris bristled, then caught Jay's eye. Something silent passed between them, agreement, not surrender. "Fine," Merris said. "But I'm not going home to hide." Jay's voice lowered. "You're not hiding," he said. "You're surviving." Merris's gaze warmed for a heartbeat. "And you?" she asked. Jay stepped closer, careful of the deputy nearby, careful of the world. "I'm staying," he said. "With you. Until this is finished." Merris held his gaze, the kind of look that felt like a decision. "So be it," she said quietly. Jay's mouth curved just barely. "I already told you," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the flagpole. Redfield's sky pressed down, heavy with a storm, heavy with change. And somewhere out there, Dawson Klein was moving through the dark, trying to decide whether to disappear or strike back. Jay drove Merris home in silence, a sheriff's unit following at a respectful distance like a shadow with a badge. Redfield streets were slick from a light rain that never quite became a storm. The windshield wipers kept time with Jay's thoughts, steady, relentless, unable to wipe away what had already happened. Merris's house was a small rental on the edge of town, clapboard siding and a porch that sagged in the middle. Someone, probably Tessa, had left the porch light on. Inside, it smelled faintly of books and the rosemary plant Merris kept alive out of stubbornness. Jay followed her in and shut the door behind them. For the first time all day, there were no microphones, no deputies, no eyes pretending not to watch. Just the two of them and the thin walls of a house that had never heard its own heartbeat this loud. Merris set her keys on the counter with careful precision. Her hands were still shaking, and she hated it. "Sit," Jay said. "I'm fine," Merris replied automatically. Jay's eyes narrowed. "Don't," he said. It wasn't a command this time. It was a request made raw by exhaustion. Merris's throat tightened. She nodded once and leaned back against the counter instead, as if meeting him halfway was the only concession she could bear. Jay came closer, slow, giving her every chance to pull away. He stopped in front of her and lifted his hand, not to her face, not yet, but to the cuff of her cardigan. "May I?" he asked. Merris swallowed. Consent was a language she spoke fluently in court and almost never in private. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like a door opening. Jay eased the sleeve back just enough to see the bruises at her wrists. His jaw tightened, but his touch stayed careful, pads of his fingers barely grazing skin as if he could soften what had been done by refusing to be rough. "They shouldn't have," he started, then stopped. Anger was too easy. What he wanted to say was harder. Merris watched him watch her, and something inside her loosened, something that had been clenched since the moment the SUV door slammed. "I'm here," she reminded him, voice low. "I'm standing. I'm arguing. You don't get to look at me like I'm gone." Jay's eyes lifted to hers. "I keep thinking about the second I saw you," he admitted. "In all the seconds after where I wasn't fast enough." "You were fast enough," Merris said. "You were smart enough." She took a breath, then let herself be honest. "And you were there. Even before you were there." Jay's mouth moved like he was going to make a joke. It didn't land. Instead, he said quietly, "You're not supposed to matter this much." Merris's pulse stumbled. "And yet," she whispered, "here we are." Jay's hand slid to her waist, the same careful steadiness he'd offered her in the hospital parking lot, only now there was no crowd to keep him cautious. Merris's fingers hooked lightly into the front of his jacket, feeling the warmth beneath the fabric, the solid proof of him. "Tell me to stop," Jay said, voice rough. Merris didn't answer with words. She tipped her chin up and closed the last inch between them. The kiss was hungry in the way only restraint could make it, months of friction and fear and almost collapsing into one sharp, perfect contact. Jay's mouth covered hers with a heat that stole the air from her lungs, and Merris felt the world narrow down to the pressure of him at her waist and the steady strength of his hands bracing her like she was something worth protecting and claiming at the same time. She made a sound against his lips, half breath, half surrender, and Jay answered by deepening it, slower now, as if he was learning her all over again with intention. His thumbs moved in small, grounding circles at her hips. Merris's fingers curled into the fabric of his jacket and pulled him closer, demanding more than comfort, demanding truth. Then, as if he'd heard the shift in her breathing and recognized it as permission, Jay eased the kiss into something softer but no less intense, his mouth tracing hers with aching care, tasting relief, tasting choice. He kissed her like he'd been afraid to want her and had finally decided wanting her was the only honest thing left. Merris pulled back just enough to breathe, their foreheads nearly touching. Jay didn't let her go. He followed, lips brushing the corner of her mouth, then her jaw, then back to her mouth again, as if he couldn't decide where to keep her. His breath warmed her skin, and his voice, when he finally spoke her name under his breath, sounded like something private and fierce. Merris slid a hand up the back of his neck, feeling the tension there, the way he was holding himself on a leash for her. She kissed him again, once, twice shorter, deliberate, making him chase it. Jay's answering exhale shuddered, and his hands tightened at her waist like the only thing keeping him steady. "It's later," she murmured, collecting on her demand from the yard, and the words made him growl in the back of his throat. "Yeah," Jay said, like he'd been holding that agreement in his body all along. "Later." Merris reached behind her, found the lamp switch by feel, and the kitchen fell into shadow. Jay followed her movement, easily proving he knew the shape of her in the dark. Outside, rain began again, soft on the porch roof, steady on the window glass, covering the sounds they didn't need the world to hear. OSBI didn't move like Redfield moved. The town did things in person, with handshakes and grudges and favors you could feel on your skin. OSBI moved on paper, warrants, subpoenas, chain of custody forms, and the quiet certainty that ink could pull down a man who thought he was untouchable. By noon the next day, Agent Rowland had 3 signed search warrants, one for Devereux Grain and Freight's offices off Main Street, one for the old yard behind the turbines, and one for Dawson Klein's rented house on the edge of the county line. A 4th, served through the sheriff, secured the Redfield Police Department property room and its digital access logs. Rowland didn't ask Redfield for cooperation. She notified them. Sheriff Danley provided deputies for perimeter and safety. OSBI provided the brains and the paperwork, and the rest of the town watched from behind curtains like it was a parade no one wanted to admit they'd been waiting for. Jay hated being kept at arm's length. Because Voss's login was implicated, OSBI treated the entire department like a contaminated scene until proven otherwise. Jay was still useful: local knowledge, routes, names, which doors squeaked, and which neighbors watched the street at sunrise. But he wasn't allowed to be alone with the evidence. He complied anyway. Clean was the only way Merris survived this, and he'd learned, late, that clean was also the only way they stayed together. Merris stayed at home with a deputy outside and a new security camera blinking above her porch. She worked anyway, drafting preservation motions and council resolutions, her laptop balanced on her knees like a loaded weapon. Jay sat beside her at the kitchen table, reading OSBI updates off his phone when they came in, his leg bouncing with a restless energy he couldn't burn off. Every time their eyes met, something private passed between them, an awareness that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with what the dark had allowed them to admit. The breakthroughs came in layers. First, toxicology confirmed Merris's suspicion. A sedative consistent with an over-the-counter antihistamine concentrated and combined with a solvent carrier, something a person could source from a supply chain without raising immediate red flags. The rag from the SUV matched the chemical profile, and the swab from Merris's cheek matched the rag. Simple, ugly proof. Second, OSBI's cell tower dump along County Road 14 lit up with a cluster of numbers that shouldn't have been there at midnight. 2 prepaid phones pinging towers in a pattern that matched the SUV route. One of those numbers appeared in the arrested suspect's pocket notebook, burner written in plain sight because arrogance looks like carelessness when you're finally being watched. Third, the property room logs. The access system recorded not just the keypad code, but the camera stills that snapped with each entry. Agent Rowland showed Merris and Jay a printed image in Merris's kitchen. Chief Voss's face caught in harsh black and white as he opened the property room door at 8:58 p.m. the night Merris was abducted. Jay stared at the photo until his eyes hurt. He used his own code, he said, disbelief cracking his voice. That's confidence, Merris finished quietly. Or it's a man who thinks the town will protect him. Roland's voice through the speakerphone stayed flat. We also pulled Devereaux grain and freight purchase orders, she said. Zip ties bought in bulk. Duct tape. Gloves. All billed to a security line item approved by Dawson Klein. Merris closed her eyes for a moment. Paper didn't lie unless someone made it. And someone had made plenty. Klein didn't disappear the way the movies promised. He tried. He sold himself the myth of vanishing, cash withdrawals, a duffel bag, a motel 2 counties over under a different name. But OSBI had his call logs, and call logs had patterns. A man like Klein didn't go quiet, he went controlled. They caught him on a 2-lane road outside Elk City, not in a blaze of sirens, but in the calm inevitability of a traffic stop. An unmarked OSBI vehicle lit him up. Another slid in behind. Klein pulled over like a man who believed politeness could still save him. He stepped out with his hands up and his smile ready. Officers, he began. Agent Rowland approached, warrant in hand. Dawson Klein, she said. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and obstruction. Klein's smile held for a fraction of a second, then fractured. This is political, he said, voice rising. You don't understand what you're. I understand, Rowland replied, and snapped cuffs on him like she'd done it 1,000 times. Get in the car. Later in the interview room, Klein asked for a lawyer. Of course he did. He still thought rules were a shield for the people who could afford them. At Devereaux Grain and Freight, OSBI agents carried boxes out in full view of Main Street. Redfield watched, stunned, as if the building itself might confess under the weight of scrutiny. They found what Merris had been digging for, a second set of environmental exhibits in a locked file cabinet behind Klein's office, each page stamped and signed and dated, proof that the missing exhibits had existed all along. Exhibit B confirmed underground storage tanks. Exhibit D documented contamination levels that would have killed the development deal on site. There were handwritten notes in the margin about containment costs and quiet remediation, as if poisoning the ground was just another line item. They also found a ledger half accounting, half confession, tracking payments labeled consulting and community relations. One entry listed a monthly amount with initials beside it, HV. Chief Voss was arrested 2 days later, not in handcuffs in the street, but in the quiet humiliation of a warrant served at his home while his neighbors watched from behind blinds. Clayton Devereaux still didn't come out in person. His attorney did. His statements did. His indignation did. But a grand jury didn't care how important you were in a town when clear evidentiary documentation showed the shape of your crime. By the end of the week, the Oklahoma Attorney General's office announced charges: conspiracy, obstruction, and environmental crimes tied to illegal storage and disposal. The development deal remained paused exactly as Merris had insisted, not dead, but now contingent on real cleanup, real transparency, and real oversight. In the quiet after the news broke, Redfield felt raw. Some people were furious. Some were ashamed. Some were relieved in a way they didn't know how to admit. The town had relied on Devereaux money for so long it had started to confuse dependence with loyalty. Merris stood on her porch one evening with a mug of tea between her hands, watching the sheriff's deputy at the curb pretend not to exist. Jay stood behind her close, his presence a steady heat at her back. "They're going to blame you," Jay said. For a while, Merris's mouth curved, tired but unapologetic. "They already did," she replied. Jay's hand slid to her waist, familiar now in a way that felt like a promise kept. "And you're still here," he murmured. Merris leaned back into him, letting her shoulders rest against his chest. "So are you," she said. Jay kissed the side of her head, soft, careful, not for an audience. "I told you," he said against her hair. "I'm not going anywhere." Merris turned in his arms, looked up at him with a steadiness that felt like the next chapter of her life. "Good," she said. "Because when this is over, I'm going to want something that doesn't feel like survival." Jay's eyes darkened warm. "Name it," he said. Merris smiled. "Home," she said. 8 months later, the wind turbines still turned on the ridge outside Redfield, and the courthouse dome still caught the afternoon sun like it was trying to shine on purpose. But the difference was in the details: the new security cameras on municipal doors, the interim chief who actually answered questions, the meeting minutes posted online without accidental omissions. Small changes. Structural ones. The kind you only noticed if you'd once been the person everyone told to stop digging. The cases didn't resolve in a single satisfying gavel drop. They resolved the way real cases did: motions, continuances, and long weeks where Merris learned to hate the word discovery for an entirely new reason. Dawson Klein took a plea after OSBI traced his consulting invoices to shell companies and found the burner phones he swore didn't exist. Chief Voss fought harder until the property room footage, the call logs, and the ledger entries stacked high enough to turn his bravado into bargaining. Clayton Devereaux never admitted guilt in public. He didn't have to. The grand jury indictment and the asset freezes said it for him. The South Highway parcel became the town's newest lesson in accountability. The state ordered environmental remediation under oversight that didn't come with handshakes. Contractors in hard hats dug and tested and hauled away soil that should never have been contaminated in the first place. Merris sat through DEQ calls and insisted on reports with every exhibit attached. When the manufacturing supplier finally signed a revised agreement, it came with transparency clauses that made the old deal look like a backroom myth. Jay transferred, too, out of the evidence-tainted department and into the sheriff's office as an investigator on a joint task force. It wasn't a victory lap. It was the safest way to keep doing the work without being swallowed by the town's old loyalties. His knee still bothered him on cold mornings. He finally went to physical therapy anyway, because Merris had learned how to win arguments by making them sound like care. They didn't plan a big wedding. Redfield planned it for them. On a warm Saturday in late October, white folding chairs appeared on the courthouse lawn as if they'd grown there overnight. Mabel's donated pies. Tessa, who'd sworn she didn't cry at anything, took charge of the flowers with the ferocity of a woman determined to make beauty out of spite. Someone strung lights across the iron fence, and when dusk fell, they looked like a constellation brought down to human height. Merris stood at the edge of the grass in a simple ivory dress that moved when the wind moved, her hair pinned back and then, inevitably, coming loose. She held a small bouquet of wildflowers and wheat, Tessa's idea, equal parts romance and insistence that Merris belonged here now. Jay waited by the steps in a dark suit that made him look unfamiliar for exactly 3 seconds. Then he shifted his weight, favoring his knee out of habit, and the familiarity came back like breath. He looked up when Merris stepped forward, and something in his face softened so completely it made the watching crowd go quiet. When Merris reached him, Jay leaned in as if to say something urgent. "If you crack a joke," Merris whispered, "I will annul it before we finish the vows." Jay's mouth curved. "That's the most romantic threat I've ever heard," he murmured. "I missed your courtroom voice." "You're going to hear it plenty," Merris said, and the promise in it wasn't only legal. Jay's gaze dropped brief, private to her lips. "Good," he said softly. "Because I like knowing exactly who I married." Mayor Callahan officiated with a trembling stack of note cards and the wary dignity of a man who'd learned, the hard way, that governance was not the same as comfort. Behind him, the courthouse dome watched like an old witness sworn to tell the truth. "We're here," the mayor began, "because sometimes a town gets to see what happens when two stubborn people decide they'd rather build than run." Merris met Jay's eyes and felt her chest tighten in the best possible way. When it was her turn, she didn't recite poetry. She spoke like herself. "Jay," she said, voice steady, "you stood between me and a door when you didn't have to. You told me to listen when I wanted to fight. You showed up again and again until showing up became us. I promised to keep asking hard questions. I promised to do it with you, not at you. And I promise that whatever comes, we do it clean." Jay's throat worked once. He nodded like he was accepting evidence. "Merris," he said, and the way he said her name still sounded like a confession. "You walked into this town like it was a case file and dared it to get better. You didn't just save yourself. You saved a place that didn't know it needed saving." His voice roughened. "I promise to be your partner. I promise to listen, even when I hate what you're telling me. And I promise you'll never stand alone again, not if I can help it." The mayor carefully slipped rings from behind the note cards like he was afraid they might disappear. Jay took Merris's hand and slid the band on, careful at the bruised memory of her wrist as if it could still ache there despite time past. Merris returned the gesture, steady and deliberate. "You may kiss," the mayor said, relief flooding his voice. Jay looked at Merris as if asking permission one more time. Merris answered by rising on her toes and drawing him down. The kiss wasn't for the crowd, even with the crowd watching. It was familiar now, heat blended with safety, want infused with trust. When they finally pulled apart, Merris rested her forehead against his for a brief second, smiling like she'd won the only argument that mattered. As was her habit every morning, Merris spent the pre-dawn hours on their porch, sipping her piping hot caffeine, and settling into a profound gratefulness that had escaped her before finding love and purpose in Redfield. Moving stealthily for a man his size and with a persnickety knee, Jay sidled up behind her, her shoulders immediately relaxing and her back fitting perfectly into his front. "Morning," Merris whispered absently. Jay leaned down and kissed her shoulder gently. "You okay?" he asked, making it clear that he'd never stopped checking. Merris nodded, then hesitated. "I'm okay, more than okay," she said. Jay's brow furrowed in confusion. "What does that mean?" Merris turned toward him, placing her mug on the porch railing before meeting his eyes. The rising sun painted delicate rays of golden light across his pale face. Her hand slid into his and squeezed once, firm, grounding. It means, she said softly, you're going to have to learn a new kind of patience. Jay stared at her for a beat, then his eyes dropped to where her free hand rested, protective and delicately against her stomach. The recognition moved through him slowly, like the dawn they were presently witnessing. Merris, he whispered. She nodded, smiling through the sudden sting of tears. Baby on the way, she said. Not far along. Don't. Jay stepped closer, one hand cupping the back of her neck, the other still holding hers like he couldn't bear to let go. He didn't speak for a moment, and in the silence, Merris heard his breath hitch, an honest, unguarded sound. I'm not, Jay started, then swallowed hard. I'm not going to mess this up. Merris's eyes warmed. I have no doubt, detective, she murmured. I have full confidence in your abilities. Jay's mouth pulled into something that was almost a chuckle, almost a sob. There's nothing you could say right now that would make me happier, he said hoarsely. You're right, I'm wrong, Merris deadpanned. Barking a laugh, Jay kissed her again, slower this time, like a vow he didn't need to say aloud because they both knew exactly where his heart lay. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. I love you, he said, voice thick. I love you. Merris repeated. Behind them, Redfield stirred. Over time, citizens came and went. The town expanded. The turbines kept turning. And finally, they settled into a future that didn't feel like a fight. In the months that followed, the South Highway cleanup continued under state oversight, and the new broadband trenches cut clean lines through red dirt like stitches closing a wound. The council adopted Merris's evidence protocols. The police department rebuilt under supervision that didn't blink. People still argued in Redfield about taxes, about football, about whether outsiders ruined things, but the arguments sounded different now. Less like ownership, more like responsibility. Merris kept her office in the old bank building, but she stopped working past midnight. Jay learned to cook 3 meals that didn't come from Mabel's. Tessa became the kind of honorary auntie who showed up with baby books and a list of names she insisted were non-negotiable. On quiet evenings, Merris and Jay sat on the porch with the wind moving through the cottonwoods and the deputy's chair finally empty at the curb. Jay would rest his hand over Merris's, over their rings, over the life growing under her heartbeat, and Merris would lean into him like she'd always meant to. They had found each other the hard way, through truth and threat and the refusal to look away. And then, after all the digging, they found what they'd been looking for.